Welcome to Health Oddity, the show that strips away the jargon and hype surrounding all things health and fitness to help you live a long, strong and energetic life. Lining up at the bar this week, here's Peter Lant, Paul Bassett and James St. Pierre.
Welcome to Health Oddity. It's episode 57. We're continuing just such a great run of guests. We're very excited today. Me particularly, it's a big moment for me to meet someone who's played such a pivotal role in my life. But I'm going to just introduce Peter and James, see how they're doing. They're just fresh off their recent bodyweight training course with Strong First, the SFB, if I got that right, the SFB.
Yep.
So Peter, how was it for you? Smashed it, I bet.
It was great. Yeah, it turns out if you're quite short, with like short limbs and that, you're quite good at bodyweight stuff. So
that's my excuse.
But it was really interesting, and it'll go. This will kind of segue into what we're going to be talking about today about how certain things cross and certain people are good at certain things. But I did the barbell course, and I couldn't pass that because I'm not built basically to be. All right, I could be built to be skilled with a barbell, but I'm not. But it turns out that actually I'm quite skilled with bodyweight, so I found it relatively easy, whereas a lot of people struggled with it. But I struggled with a barbell where a lot of people sailed through that as well. So, we're straight into it with a little nugget there. You can't be good at everything. So it doesn't matter. Don't worry about it.
Did you try these excuses with your coach? Because they never work when I use them.
Well, no. I mean, we've both got the same coach and I try to do that. And he's like, no, stop it.
No.
Well, I told him, didn't I? I said my 5 rep max is very close to my 1 rep max. And that's just the way I'm built. And he was like, no, it's not. It's because you're not recruiting enough motor neurons. Yeah. So he was like, yeah, basically that's wrong. Yeah. you just need to get stronger. And I was like, oh, okay.
What about you, James? How was it for you?
Yeah, it was a great weekend. I was one of the ones who found it a lot more challenging, found it a lot more difficult, but I am making progress. So I'm happy about that. And I'm really excited about today because the guests that you've lined up, I've read about for a long time, and certainly in the last 5 years has been quite influential on the way I've done things as well. So I think this is going to be really good episode. Looking forward to diving in.
Well, it's also worth saying there, James, that all that talk we had a few weeks ago about you practicing the pistol actually came good because you managed to get the pistol squat. And that was looking pretty good. You still got work to do, as you said, but I think it's pretty impressive. And you were holding your toes while doing it, so fantastic work.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, the all the pistol squats in the swimming pool paid off.
That's it. Fantastic. So let's get on to our guest. For me, I'm very excited to welcome Phil Maffetone. So how are you doing, Phil?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. Hi everybody, and it's great to be here.
So Phil, Phil needs a proper introduction because Phil is an influential figure in the endurance world, but not only endurance world. Anyone who knows their onions will have come across Phil's books, his works, his teachings in some capacity. We, right from the start of putting this podcast together, it was really important that we started to introduce you guys, the listeners, and perhaps any coaches or anything who's listening, to some of the most interesting ideas that are out there, but also ones that work. And it's often the case that the strength and conditioning world, nutrition world, etc., don't necessarily interact with the endurance world. And sometimes we're kind of talking the same thing, just using a different means of expression, a different language to express it. And I think having people like Dan John, people like Paul McElroy on, their perspectives are going to marry so well with Phil's. And now for me, there's probably 2 people in the fitness industry who've had the biggest effect on my life. The first one was Chris McDougall, because I read the book Born to Run. And before that, I was a broken person. I was broken physically, mentally. My diet was awful. I was in a right mess. And I read that book because my wife got it at an airport. And I thought, oh, what's this thing about people running hundreds of miles? And then I read it and I was like, I'm just doing something wrong. I'm not the one that's broken. And I started down a little route where I started to find interesting people. And I was listening to a podcast with a guy called Dr. Mark Cucuzella. And he said, "Oh, you should read this book." He was just talking to one of the co-hosts, and he said, "You should read this book by Phil Maffetone called The Big Book of Endurance and Racing." And I bought that book, and I just literally have never looked back. I read it literally probably in a couple of days, and I reread it about 4 times, and I was just on a route. And ever since then, it's been actually a big part of my business, because I utilize some of your nutrition strategies, and my clients have had probably for the last 5 years fantastic results on it. Welcome, Phil. Phil is an awesome endurance coach. He is a wild thinker around all things fitness. He is influential in so many ways. He's coached some of the most high achieving endurance athletes out there, people such as Mark Allen, 6-time Hawaii Ironman athlete and winner. He has worked in the music industry with a number of people trying to help them get on top of their health. But he's also running a really successful website, philmaffetone.com, which is just reaching out and spreading the word of how to train healthy as an endurance athlete, how to look after your body, how to eat differently. You don't have to get on this train where you break yourself in order to run endurance races or kind of give your health over to the race. You can have optimal health and optimal performance. Welcome, Phil. You've been a big part of my life, so I'm looking forward to this one.
Thank you. This is great. And yeah, just to add a touch of what you just said, we want it all.
Yeah.
We want.
Can we get it though, Phil? Can we get it all?
We can within reason. There's no fountain of youth, but we can perform really well until we're dead, and we can be healthy while getting fit, which is sort of the big problem we've had for generations. It's sort of and it's promoted by society. It's the no pain, no gain thing. It's the sacrificing your health to get a little more strength, a little more endurance, a little more whatever. And that's just not acceptable. And I was fortunately able to learn that really early on as a student. I noticed that, some of these athletes are not all that healthy. What's going on here? And so, we can have it all within obvious reasons, but it's kind of up to us. We're in charge, and we make decisions based on the information, and we want to get the right information, not the hype, not the commercials, not the social jargon that really takes us astray.
So I suppose to start the conversation, great to get a little bit of background, but before I forget, we had an awesome guest on called Dr. Stuart McGill, who's a back specialist. And he was saying that you can't have performance and health to a degree, because he sees so many people with chronic back pains who've been professional athletes in the past, and they push their body so hard. And he's saying, you don't see many elite athletes in their 50s and 60s wanting to be masters athletes, ex-athletes becoming masters athletes. What is your perspective on that?
Well, I think that's just wrong. I think, we tend as a society and as a group of health practitioners, we tend to confuse things that are common with things that are normal. It's common for athletes to be injured. That doesn't mean it's normal. It means something's wrong. And so, that's a very important thing. And I hear from athletes I worked with for years who were in sports that involved a lot of training and a lot of intense racing. Mark Allen, who I'm still in touch with, we did a segment, last month, and he was answering a question similar to this about how he's doing now. He's in his 60s, and he has no problems, and he's quite healthy, and he's still quite active, not competing, but he doesn't want to, and that's the way it should be. And unfortunately, we don't see that. We see people getting hip replacements, people unable to exercise, people. I mean, one of the extremes is in the American football world, where these athletes, when they retire, a lot of them really get sick. A lot of them become diabetics because of the hormonal influences on their body from the kinds of training they did, and that's just unacceptable. So we, in our society, we tend to put things in a box. Okay, you're an athlete today, now you're a retired athlete, and and are you this, or are you that? Well, we're everything, and we can have it all, instead of saying I want to be in that box. It's
Is this a thing that you'll see changing then? So like Stu McGill say, he was talking about what's happened in the past. So Olympic athletes in their 20s, 30s, whatever, don't become masters athletes later on because they're all spent. But what about like people who are doing it now, and then what they'll be like in the future? Do you see that changing? Do you see the people being able to carry on, not necessarily in the Olympics and stuff like that, but carry on, and because it's a product of how people used to train, but we've actually moved forwards. So do you think that's?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's changing. You're starting to see more people. You certainly see the masters world getting larger and more competitive. They're one of the few, and it's because of the influx of the younger people who are suddenly now masters athletes. But you're as a group, a subgroup of runners, they're one of the few groups, along with the young front pack runners, that are breaking the records. And virtually everyone else is slowing down, literally slowing down. And so I think we see the trends, but there's still, what's really difficult is breaking the tradition. Breaking the tradition of injuries are almost accepted as part of the game. In running, it's not a contact sport. If you're a soccer player and you run into somebody, you could get hurt, but runners don't usually run into people or things. Sometimes they do, but getting injured because you're a runner is why doesn't anybody stop and say, well, gee, what happened? Let's trace that injury back to when it first started or before it first started. And it's like a Sherlock Holmes thing for me. As a clinician, I want information, and I gather this information, and then I come up with, I see the problem here. And now it's easier to correct, and it's easier to say, okay, here's what I recommend you do with your schedule, because your schedule is way too much for you, and therefore, let's recommend this, that, and that, and then measuring.
I can think of two examples straight away, like in sport now. So there's Cristiano Ronaldo, who's just moved to Man U. He's, how old is he? 36, 38, something like that. And he's still going strong. And is it Tom Brady? I don't know anything about American football. Was it Tom Brady? He was like 40. He's the same age as me, and he's still going.
Yeah.
And they train very differently to everybody else, don't they?
Yes, they do. They do. And I think there's an awareness that they have, which is a real necessity. And I've worked with some people, who have done really wonderful things at these so-called older ages. And it was always like, well, gee, how did Priscilla win that marathon? I mean, how could somebody 42 years? And I'd say, why is that so unusual? And, and Mark, I would say Mark had 2 more wins in Kona. If he wanted them, and he actually should have won the 2 wins before he won his first, but he had some bike problems and mechanical breakdowns that he couldn't control. So a lot of athletes really just, competition is tough. It's not physically tough. It's mentally tough. And at some point, you're ready to pack it in, and that's that's their choice. But a lot of them can go on longer, and then changing to the masters world is really a nice thing to do.
You started seeing some of these things in the 70s, didn't you? So you were a sprinter when you started, if I remember rightly. And
I was.
And then, but you started seeing these trends. So it must have been, I mean, you've kind of plowed the furrow for a lot of other people, but I mean, it's tough to be at odds with the general establishment's thinking. It must be quite tiring. At times you must have felt like it was pretty fruitless. I mean, how did people end up gravitating towards you? What was, because there was, the traditional thinking was very different.
It was, and I think part of it was because people were they just weren't getting where they wanted to be from a performance standpoint, and a lot of like other patients who are not competitive athletes, they have some illness that's not maybe clear cut. I have diabetes, but they have these vague signs and symptoms that a lot of doctors ignore, and they go from one practitioner to another, and then eventually end up in my office. And but with the athletes, a lot of it was I'm tired of putting all this time in and not being able to perform up to my, I'm 26 years old and I haven't run a personal best in 5 years. Well, that's enough of a problem right there to make one stop and think, there's got to be a better way. And the other way was I had the kind of a practice early on where I worked with athletes who were injured, and I would, find out why they're injured and was able to correct those injuries. And I kind of got known as the guy to go see when you're injured, because I could fix your knee quickly and get you on your way. But I also early on realized that I don't want to do that, because all they were doing was I was fixing their knee and they were going out and overtraining again and coming back a month later with another injury or a recurrent knee problem. And that's when I really became a coach, because I said, whatever you're doing isn't working. I'd have people bring in their training schedules, their diaries, wherever they happen to be, and I would look at it and I'd say, well, here's your body. This is what I'm seeing here. Here's your schedule. There's no match here. This is insane. And so I would take out my pen and start crossing off workouts. And
that must have been tough for people to see, because
it was really tough, because they were under the impression that they were supposed to do, I don't know, when Salazar got well known, he was quoted as, how important running 100 miles a week was. And then all of a sudden, everybody was trying to run 100 miles a week. And the idea of less is more, and then the idea of train slow to get fast, those were pretty early concepts that I had. And I had a hard time explaining them. I knew they worked because I was seeing it, but how do you explain that to a traditional endurance athlete or traditional coach or a traditional physiologist who we are a glucose based body, and you train fast to get fast, and it's the idea of clinical observation was just not very strong. Well, I do this because it works. Oh no, that's not a reason.
So I was just going to ask you, Phil, for some of our listeners who are not maybe, I mean, the three of us obviously are very aware of you and the kind of the big differences of approach and opinion, and then the success that you've had and the amount of that your work has sort of proliferated through not just the endurance world but tapped into other worlds as well. Your whole the math system of training and the heart rate training and that sort of thing. How long ago did you actually formalize this? And I know I think I've heard you speak before where you've said, you know, you maybe went into a conference or a convention to talk to people about this sort of thing, and they would be more the standard athletes and coaches, and it was very sort of you know, shunned at the time, or seen as very, you know, certainly not this non-conventional. But how did you come across this, and how did you develop this yourself, and how long did it actually take you to develop this math formula?
Well, I'm still developing it. And just as an aside, MAF stands for maximum aerobic function. And I learned about the aerobic system, which is what McGardle called it in his textbook, when I was a student. And up until that point, the idea that we have this long-term energy system in sports was kind of an odd thing. And then even more crazy is that, well, we're not a glucose-based animal. We also burn fat. Wow, that's interesting. Oh, fat, aerobic, slow, endurance, you know, it kind of all started coming together even, you know, as a student. And then you just didn't see a lot of people talking about fat, even using the word fat when the topic of energy was being discussed. And I was familiar with fasting, and I was familiar with ketones and ketogenic eating, and you know, it just, things just step by step gradually came together. And so there was no one big thing. There was no, I didn't sit down and say, okay, now I got to figure out how to do this. A lot of my approach was assessment based. So even as a therapist, if I was going to work on someone's injured knee, I didn't have a cookbook remedy. That was really a bad thing that I had realized was happening in healthcare, in the physical therapy type world, where, you know, you do this, that, and that for people who have a knee problem. And sometimes I'd, you know, when I was out in public, I'd say, well, do you do that for the right knee and the left knee, the same things? Or is there a left knee therapy? And so I didn't make friends easily, but it just kind of all came together. And the assessment part was always a big, important consideration for me. And so it was not just assessing a person's physical body to figure out how they got injured and how we can fix it and how we can prevent it. But from a training standpoint, some of the simple things, like how do we know this endurance athlete is getting better without waiting 3 months, 5 months until the big race? And then when the big race comes and they don't perform well, we say, oh, well, that training approach was wrong. I want to know right away. With strength, you've got some indications. You know, fairly soon we can come back to that. But you know, the assessment of an athlete in their training as they progress, and I want to know, are they going off course? And if they are, then we have to reel them back in. And we, you know, we don't ever guarantee anything, but you almost guarantee success when you monitor, when you evaluate athletes along the way, because those objective evaluations are objective and they really don't lie. And so we're talking about like the MAF test, which I know you're familiar with, and the you know, the dietary challenge, the 2-week test, where we help people figure out how to personalize their food intake, because strangely enough, we're all different. What a concept.
I use the 2-week test with my clients very frequently on their first month of working with me. When I was thinking of coming up with a surefire way of helping someone see very quick results, but a very low risk to their well-being, because obviously what I didn't want to do is just give them a meal plan and say, eat this 500 calories less. I wanted something that I could believe in, and I felt that would give them information that was unique to them. And the 2-week test had a massive effect for me. I lost 4 kilos in 2 weeks when I was really overweight. I had chronic stomach problems, and I've never had them since I did it. But that's why I'm kind of a bit of a believer from it, because it's not a diet, is it? It's a test. You use the word
It's a test. It's a challenge. If you're talking to a traditional clinician, and they might think test is taking some blood and coming up with it's a challenge. So you're challenging your body with a different way of eating, and you're assessing. So you the way I often do it is I say, people, just write down all your complaints. Pretend you're going to a practitioner who's going to actually talk to you and listen to what you're saying. Write down all your complaints, all your signs and symptoms. And then you do this 2-week period of eating very differently, very healthy. And at the end of that 2 weeks, you look at your list. Is this better? Oh, that's better. Oh, this is gone. This is, and yeah, you're right. It's sort of, for many people, it's an amazing thing. They turn into a new person. What I'm still confused about, and I saw this, I've seen it my whole career, is people go through this and they're a new person. They could train better, they could work better, all their aches and pains are gone, they sleep better, they think better, all their gut problems, it's like they're a whole nother human being, but then they can't maintain it because their friends are eating junk food, and I guess I should do that, because it's just very strange. We have a very powerful society that tells us to do. These companies spend billions and billions of dollars every year to tell us to eat badly, to tell us to just do it. And we watch sports on TV, and the announcers say, there's Big Joe. He plays hurt. He's so cool, and he's got all these bandages on. And if you're an 8-year-old kid, you can't wait to be hurt and have all these bandages on, because it's cool. It's very sad.
I mean, it's disjointed, that, isn't it? Because say in sports someone's hurt. Like, was it Terry Butcher who played with a broken neck? Somebody played with a broken neck for England, didn't they? At the end of one of the matches. I can't remember, in the 80s, I think. And you see that and you're like, oh God, he's nails, right? So kids want, like you said, kids want to be like that. But then on the other side, they'll eat junk as well, because it's literally shoved in their faces. So it's kind of disjointed. You're like, well, I want to be this person, but then you can't be that bloody minded not to eat the rubbish and actually eat healthily, which isn't hard. It's harder to a sports person than it is to eat healthily. It's weird.
It is. None of this is hard, but we have, and the tobacco industry and their marketing from, going back to the 40s, where doctors were doing commercials on, smoke this cigarette if you have a sore throat because it will cool your throat, and we still have that today, not those particular commercials, but they still find ways to trick people into abusing themselves and hurting themselves and killing themselves.
But you worked with a population of very motivated people in many ways, because if they weren't winning races, then they had to do something about it. And many of them were lucky enough to find the right kind of people to help them, and being like yourself. But the general population. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it was from a statistical standpoint. I was, people didn't randomly come in my clinic because they were driving by. It was a very specific, somebody referred me, or I heard you lecture. However, I could tell you some, I won't, but I could tell you some very sad stories about athletes who came in, quickly became really great and said, I got to go back to the way I was training before because I have to. and they would burn out again and never be heard from ever. And those sad things have occurred too. And I what do you say to these people initially? You can kind of tell that they're desperate because they're injured, or they've got a big race coming up in 6 months, and can you help get me to that? It's like a heroin addict. Okay, I'm going to be good for this week, and I could be good, sure, not a problem. The week's over, and then now they get some heroin and they're back doing that again. And it's not human nature, because it's not natural to abuse ourselves. It's the nature of our society, which the marketing people and the money and greed, it's a big part of it.
I think that comes across with the human nature thing. You mentioned like heroin addicts, like same with alcoholics. Say, so George Best, famous Irish football player, alcoholic, played in the 60s and what have you, and he's alcoholic. And then he became dry, and he got to his year. He'd done a whole year of not drinking. So what does he do? He goes out to celebrate by having a drink. And he goes down the pub to celebrate not drinking for a year, and then he's back into it again. So I suppose it's kind of that. It's like a drug. Like the people come in and they go, right, you've fixed me, and I'm better than I was. But now if I go back to the old way, that'll make me even better. And it's
that's the rationale.
Yeah.
So with your whole approach to nutrition, that was obviously especially from the endurance angle, and the kind of people that you were talking to initially around that. I know that your approach to nutrition has got great potential to improve everyone's life, not just the endurance athletes amongst us, but everyone. That must have been met with huge, not necessarily mistrust, but that was very, very different, wasn't it, from the conventional wisdom at the time?
It sure was,
and the prevailing wisdom probably still now, I'd imagine.
Quite so. It's still the prevailing wisdom, because it's what keeps the sports magazines and those popular websites going from the standpoint of advertising dollars. But you're right. It was really tough, because this was. I've been in all sports, so I've been all over the place. But when I first started, I was seeing a lot of runners, because my clinic was in the New York City suburbs, and this was the 70s, and the running boom was exploding. And there were plenty of injured athletes, and then the running lore, it was a religion, and part of it was you eat as much carbohydrate as you can, and protein is bad, fat is bad, which raises your carbohydrate intake even more. And pretty much almost all the carbohydrates were unnatural processed carbohydrates. The word junk food hadn't been born yet. That would come about, I think, in '83 maybe. But it was and during by the '80s, I started seeing runners who were putting a lot of training in, who were becoming over fat, and that was a shock. And then I started measuring body fat, and it was really difficult back then, but it was possible. I actually had a water weight in my clinic in the basement. People could get in the water and be weighed underwater after they exhale. It was quite a good thing. And now we have DEXA, but even better is the simple measuring your waist and height. But I had to be careful what I said in the beginning, and I'm trying to think. Oh, it was the Boston Marathon Expo. I I don't know how or why they got me to lecture, but I was one of the speakers. And then sort of at the end, we had a panel. I don't know, there were 5 of us, a couple of physiologists, the coach, Bill Rogers was there. And this is like during the carbo loading dinner. And so we're all up there and, somebody asks a question about nutrition and these guys say a bunch of things. And I couldn't help it. But I said, look, I said, look what you're eating. Everything is white. You've got white pasta, white bread, white cake with white icing. And how nutritious is that? And you're going to be running tomorrow. And then somebody next to me said, well, they're carbo loading. I said, well, it's, we're hours and hours away from the race. And how long do those carbohydrates, as glycogen last in the body? And it just happens to be that so many people bonk at 18 miles in a marathon. Gee, that's when we start running out of glycogen stores. And I had a good sense of what I was trying to do and why that was a bad idea. But it was really, you just, again, you don't make friends that way.
It's still a thing that as well. I did a 100-mile walk a couple of months ago. And somebody asked me, they were like, are you going to eat loads of like carbs the night before you start? And I was like, well, no, because I'll use them up before I go to bed.
Yeah, I think it was I want to say it was the 1972 Olympics, and they were coming into the marathon start, and they had a segment on the famous announcer said, and we talked to the marathoners, and we had to ask, what do marathoners eat for breakfast? And the camera panned to this stack of pancakes that, pancakes. And that was an image. And back then the Olympics on TV had huge audiences.
Yeah.
And so that image, and that was sort of 72, that was while the running boom was thinking about exploding, and all that, and all, of course, the advertisement, and it was hard. And is it better today? It's better today, but there's still problems. There are still traditions are really, really, really difficult to deal with, because everyone has that in their being, in their, we learn these traditions as kids. Anything you learn as a child really tends to stay with you, and that's why the traditions linger on. And you explain, this, that, and that to an athlete, it's going to solve their problem. It's going to make them reach their human potential, and then they do. But they still have this, should I be eating fat? I thought protein was bad. My friends, they all sprint to the finish of each training run, and I'm gonna bulk up because that's the only way you get strong, of course. And if I'm a few kilos heavier on race day, I make up for it by being stronger. But it's like these weird, where does this come from?
It's interesting. Yeah, it kind of leads us into another area. We had a strength coach on a few weeks back called Paul McElroy. Both me and Peter work with him on our own training for our own goals. But one of his philosophies, or his main kind of philosophy that guides his programming, is this comfort zone expansion, where when he's programming for a power lifter, in his view, the only time you should ever peak is in a competition, because unless you're a competitive power lifter or competitive athlete, there's no reason for you to peak. And I remember when I first read your big book of endurance racing, we were using heart rate monitors, and we were training slow to go fast. And that for me kind of blew my mind, and it really actually set me down a philosophical kind of route that made me seek out other sources with similar kind of viewpoints. So for the endurance world, what is this concept of training slow to run fast, and why should someone do it?
Well, it's simply the concept is simply the idea that by training slower at lower intensity rather than high intensity, we're going to develop our aerobic system really well. And the aerobic system is important because that's most of our endurance race. Once we get past a mile, certainly a 5K, we start relying a lot more on our aerobic system. So that's one of the reasons. The other is that we can burn more body fat for energy at lower intensities. And that happens in the aerobic muscle fibers, which are spread out all over the body within every muscle, except the jaw joint, which is all anaerobic. And we want to train those aerobic muscle fibers to burn more fat. And when we have more fat, we have a lot more energy for training, for recovery, and for racing. And we improve the aerobic muscle fibers, which are the fibers that prevent injuries. Those are the fibers that have long-lasting capabilities to support us in the course of a day, in the course of training, in the course of racing. Just sitting at our desk, if we have good aerobic function, the damage from sitting is a lot less. But also, when we burn more fat, we conserve our glycogen, so that in an endurance race, even a 5K or 10K, a marathon, 100-mile walk or run, or an Ironman, we want that glycogen later in the race, because there's a good chance we're going to be running a lot faster at a higher intensity at the very end. And if we have glycogen stores, our anaerobic muscles, those fast twitch muscles, will have all the energy they need. But the hidden thing in all of this is that even at high intensities, people who have a good aerobic system burn a pretty good amount of fat, a surprisingly high amount of fat. And my friend and colleague Paul Larson has done some work on this. That's how we met. He was part of a study that showed that high intensity training causes, with certain kinds of athletes who are trained a certain way, and there's a lot of fat burning taking place at high intensity. So we don't automatically shift into sugar burning because we're going fast. And I sent him a test I did with I think Mike Pigg, triathlete from years ago, where at his max heart rate on a treadmill, he was still burning 30% fat because he was so well aerobically developed. And so that's a very important thing.
And I've used the 180 formula, not only with myself, but some of my clients as well, to train them for endurance events. And that was a very interesting concept to me, to have that direct feedback from my body to tell me where we're at. And I know, James, you've got a heart rate monitor and you do your runs with that to become, I know back in the 80s, the old heart rate monitors were the size of small fridges, but
yeah, there was nothing. I mean, I started, in the 70s, I had to manually test people, and I said, this is not working. And I had already studied biofeedback, and I knew I needed an objective indicator, and heart rate was such a good one. And there was a cardiac monitor that were being used in hospitals, and I thought, this is what I'm going to use. And it was like, okay, he's got a heart monitor in his office, and he puts you on it, and he has you run, and sometimes he runs with you, and then I got a second one. Wow, he has 2 heart monitors. And then it wasn't until I think 83 when the first wireless heart monitor came out, and they were available and people were buying them. And I started when I was lecturing, I would ask people how many have heart monitors, and in the beginning, a few people raised their hand, and eventually a lot of people raised their hand. And then I started saying, what do you do with them? And a lot of them say, well, we just see how high we can get our heart rate.
Yeah. That's what I always get from everyone. It's like, my heart rate's in the red.
Human nature again, isn't it? See how far you can go.
Yeah, we want to objectively measure no pain, no gain. It's one thing to hurt, but those are subjective feelings. Those are emotions. We want to see the numbers.
What do you think about Apple Watches in this Fitbit revolution and things like that? Because we got so much data now. What do you see? What do you think about that?
Well, data is a very valuable thing. It's how we do studies. But it has to be practical. The information we get from it has to be practical, useful for the average person. It's one thing to work with high-end athletes. We sort of have unlimited accessibility to tests and various things. But for the average person, we need to make it simple and useful. And so the watches are okay. The fingertip, when we start exercising and the heart rate goes up, distal pulses are less accurate. And so I like the chest strap and I like the earbud, which picks up the heart rate really well. And so I like to still be accurate with that. The watches are okay. If you're starting to work out and you haven't done anything before and you've got a watch, okay, use the watch just to get a sense of, okay, this is what it feels like to be at a 130 heart rate, and that's what it feels like at 150. And my idea with heart monitors in the beginning was that this is a biofeedback tool, and like all other biofeedback tools, we use it initially to train the brain, and then we can wean off it. And I thought, people are intuitive, and this is a way of bringing out their intuition, but it didn't turn out that way.
Have you?
Not everyone thinks like that.
Have you? Like a lot of our listeners will be very interested in strength training. So have you worked with many people with a focus on strength training, a pure strength, like power athletes, like powerlifters or weightlifters or gymnasts?
Yeah,
and things like
Olympic lifters. Yeah, I have from the beginning, almost from the beginning. And I also in the beginning, I'm not sure why. I think it was some guy who got injured, and he was well known in the bodybuilding world, and he sent me a lot of his bodybuilding friends, and I just had to at some point say, I'm not seeing any more of these people anymore, because it was the ultimate body abuse. Plus they were also weak.
Sorry.
So I have, and I knew from measurements that endurance athletes were particularly weak especially runners as a population. And then, I had this issue because I knew fairly early on that traditional weightlifting to get stronger, where you go to the gym and you lift weights, or you're doing some machines and you're bulking up, that activity could impair aerobic progress. So during my aerobic period, which could be 3 months, 4, 5, 6 months, whatever it seemed to need for that athlete, I would not recommend any weightlifting, because I knew it was going to potentially inhibit progress. And that in the post aerobic base period, where they might be doing speed work, they might be competing, or during a period where they weren't progressing aerobically, that's when they would do their anaerobic work. And it was a little difficult. The concept was difficult, but the the bottom line is I saw a lot of these athletes who were doing exactly what should have been done, and their strength gains were kind of minimal. And so I started looking at, the obvious example is the Olympic lifter. How do these people get strong without gaining weight? They don't want to be in another weight category. So, it's one of those things where you just put two and two together and you say, oh, that's what I need to recommend. So, we touched on this issue of, what's your one-time max, and what I've used is 6 times. You want 80% of your one-time max, and that usually is about 6 reps. And that if you did a squat, you pick a weight off the floor, you bring it up somewhere, you do 6 squats. They don't have to be full squats, because a half squat is really as efficient as you want to get, especially if you're a runner. And if you're competing, it's different. But if you're in weightlifting, but if you're a runner, keep it simple, and the strength gains are incredible. And I still have a dynamometer, so I can measure people. It's like I go into town and I'm sitting on a bench looking for somebody. Hey, can I measure your strength? I like measuring people. And it's amazing how many weaklings there are out there. They're everywhere.
Well, they say the grip strength is lower now in the male population than it's ever been. It's weaker than our fathers and things like that. And there must be to sedentary lives. Yeah,
and there was a study on kids and mile times being so much slower than their parents. That was a few years ago.
I was just going to ask Phil, what would be the sort of the mechanistic reason for if you were undertaking strength training, that would inhibit improvements in aerobic capacity? If you were trying to do strength training and build aerobic capacity at the same time, can you just sort of explain, why that might be?
Yeah, stress is really the answer. There's a biochemical stress, and there's a physical stress. With the physical stress, it's just fatigue. As we know, we do some traditional weightlifting. We lift to fatigue, and now we have to recover. And that recovery can take 48 hours, 72 hours, maybe, depending. And I call that the weakness window. And in that window, we're weak because we've hit fatigue. Now the muscles have to recover, and when they recover, they're better off. But in the process of recovering, those muscles are weak, literally. And so what do we do in that weakness window? Do we work out because we're endurance athletes? Well, that's not a good thing to do. Now we're stressing the entire system, and aerobic muscle function is pretty sensitive to stress. Fat burning is very sensitive to stress. We dump out a little stress hormone, and fat burning really slows down. So that's one of the main reasons. The important question is, can we get strength without doing that? Of course we can. And the way we do it, and I learned this, which sort of helped bring all this into practice for me, is I worked with brain injured children and adults, stroke patients, kids that are born with a brain injury, and their muscles are impaired, and some of them have zero contraction in a muscle. And with biofeedback, we know we can get those muscles to start contracting again fairly easily. And how do we do that? How do we get the patient who had a stroke, who can't use his arm or can't walk right? Well, there are muscles that have really shut down. There are muscles that are over tight, and then there are muscles that have shut down. That's the muscle balance, muscle imbalance concept. When we have a shoulder pain, movement causes pain because some of the muscles are too tight, others are too weak, so the joint doesn't move right. And therapy involves finding the primary thing, which is, I think, in most cases, is the weakness. And when you tighten the weakness, the tightness goes away. So anyway, in brain injury, what the goal is for these patients is to get the motor centers in the brain, which is where movement begins, to send a message to the muscles, to the muscle fibers that have been shut down, turned off, that are not working, to contract. And it sometimes takes a few minutes, but sometimes you get these people who have no movement and you can get them to move a little bit. Well, that's suddenly the brain is contracting fibers that weren't contracting. And in an athlete, any given muscle has a whole lot of fibers that does not contract. And even if you max out on a lift, there's still fibers left that are not contracting. That's the whole idea of the old idea of a pistol. You know, the coach sneaks up behind you and shoots the pistol. Well, you know, he shocks your brain. You get this sympathetic barrage, and sympathetics make us stronger. And we've all heard whether it's a rumor or not, the physiological concept makes sense. You know, the mother whose kid gets caught under the car and she lifts up the car, this little, you know, wimpy woman who can't lift much of anything, but she now all of a sudden she can lift the car because this sympathetic stimulation. We can mimic that. We can get the brain contracting muscle fibers to train the muscle to be, as soon as you contract more fibers, you're stronger. So if you contract more fibers and you kind of do that therapeutically on a regular basis, you get stronger, but you bypass the whole fatigue system. And so
you talk about
by doing that, you don't worry about the aerobic system being impaired.
Yeah, we were talking to Paul McElroy about it, or he was talking to us about it rather. But apparently, your average person only contracts like 30%. And then a trained individual, it'll be somewhere like 50%. And nobody knows whether the trained individual is because of genetics or because they're trained or a mixture of both. You know, so it's one of those two.
Certainly not a genetic thing.
Right. Okay. So it is because they're trained in. Okay. So that's how, I mean, like I say, me and Paul work with Paul McElroy, and that's how we work. He keeps us within comfort. So you train within comfort, but your comfort just expands.
Yeah, keeps going.
So, you know, you never go to a 1 rep max. And his opinion is you never need to. The only reason your average person will go to a 1 rep max is for ego, which is true, right? Or for Instagram, which is the same thing.
Yes.
So, but bringing it back to your method as well, because you were saying, you know, for endurance, say, you don't know how well you're doing until you do the race. But that's not true, right? Because if you train the way you talk about, you can expand your comfort zone and you can see that happening in training. And if it's not, you can adjust the reps in our world, or the heart rate or whatever, and see that within training. So you know that when you get to that race, your peak has grown. So, you know, we'll talk about the broader the base, the higher the peak. And the way we talk about in strength is if your base gets wider, so your 10 rep max goes up, every other rep max goes up. So your any rep max goes up, your every rep max goes up. That's what Paul was saying. And I suppose it's the same in endurance. You can run further at the same heart rate as you used to be able to run not as far at, then you can run faster in your race, I suppose. Is that true?
Yeah, the race would be predictable based on the pace you could run at now. So if you could run a 5K in 20 minutes at your MAF heart rate, your 180, if you're honest with the formula, what you come up with, and you've seen yourself progress, which kind of confirms that the heart rate you've chosen is the right one. And then after 3 months, you could now run 17 minutes for that same 5K, same course, same shoes, same time of day. you're guaranteed to be able to run, to be able to race a faster 5K, a faster 10K, a faster marathon, because now your aerobic system is more efficient, you're burning more fat, and your performance is higher. So there's a prediction pattern, and in fact, when those predictions don't take place, we have to look at, was it just a bad day, or are we missing something here? And
I suppose that's where your three concepts of stress. You got the mental, the physical, and is it the environmental?
The biochemical.
Biochemical, yes. So
yeah, those stresses have to be juggled all the time. That's really what it's all about, is stress. The physical stresses are, the body and the muscles and joints. The biochemistry is the fat burning and sugar burning, and the nutrition, and the mental, emotional is. There's a lot of education to that mental, emotional stress. It's not just, psychology or mental imagery. It's an understanding. Do I understand what I'm doing? Can I keep away from the advertisers and the no pain, no gainers?
Yeah. This is why we're here, by the way. This is why we do this. This was it. Originally, when we started, we said in the very first episode, we want, and I was talking to somebody about this today, we want to get people like you on who have done this stuff for years and know what they're talking about, thought leaders, like Paul keeps saying, thought leaders in the industry who, so instead of going on Google, and finding all this rubbish, like, people can come here instead and tell us and say, who do you, can you get this person on, because they really know what they're talking about, and I want to hear more about it. And we were talking about this, about authors of books and what have you, and all these things who you can't ask the question. That's what we're doing right now. We're asking the question because that's exactly what we're trying to get past. All the rubbish that's out there, we want to be able to sift through that.
Yeah. It's a great service. I mean, this is the time of the internet and information. Of course, the other advertisers, those greedy people, they're taking advantage of the internet too. But I think I almost want to say we were starting to get a good foothold by the 21st century, and as the years went by, you see it in society. Restaurants, have a little thing saying, if you're gluten intolerant, let us know. Well, that's just a stupid thing, but it's a step in the right direction. It's not really gluten that people are sensitive to; it's the carbohydrate. But suddenly, COVID hit, and what happened? People were locked down and told they couldn't, go to certain restaurants. Essentially, they were told they can only eat junk food, and that's what they did.
Yeah.
And they gained weight, and they were stressed. The incidence of suicide went up. People weren't working out. They were gaining weight, and I don't know what's going to happen. Have we gone back 20 years?
It's a weird stratification in a way, isn't there? Because what I've noticed over the years of following you, starting reading these books, is that now you have this huge resource yourself as your website. And no doubt there are people like myself and other people who are interested individuals who can now find you. In the past, we wouldn't have been able to find you. But I wonder whether there's a stratification between the majority of people getting worse and worse, because we could see, like, the obesity epidemic in every country increasing. Not only are people overweight by about 70% of the population, the actual obese level within that 70% is there increasing, so that more and more people within that 70% are now obese, not just overweight. But people who want to be elite, people who want to be really, really healthy, now have much more access to greater information. But it's kind of like I work and straddle the two, because I do get people who are interested in being a little bit more elite, and but then other people from that 70% who wanted to try and break free, and they find it so hard to break free.
Yeah. Just a note on that. I introduced the term over fat a few years ago to describe people who had excess body fat. And if you only look at obesity, you miss a lot of people. If you only look at obesity and overweight, you still miss a lot of people. In fact, in some populations, over 40% of non-obese, normal weight individuals have excess body fat.
Mm.
And excess body fat is not just an issue of looks. It's a physiology. The biochemical effects of body fat are dramatic, especially on the immune system.
Mm.
And so in the more recent worldwide, the global estimates of overfat around the world, it's over 80%. It was 91% in the US when I did that research a couple of years ago. In the UK, it was I want to say 88%. I don't remember exactly. I did something in India. 80.5% of adults in India are overfat. What's
So
happening?
where's this fat hidden? Are you talking visceral fat and like
a lot of it in certain
and...
populations? Yeah, in the Indians, there are these skinny people, but they've got this visceral fat, and visceral fat is it's sort of the hidden fat, but it's also the worst fat because it reflects the fat around the heart, which affects the heart in a very negative way. And if you want to know if you're over fat or not, you can get a DEXA scan, but I don't recommend doing that unless you're doing research or unless you're obsessed with fat. But you can just measure your waist and measure your height. Don't assume you're the same height as when you were 25 years of age, and your waist should be less than half your height. And if it's not, you're over fat. Don't blame me if you're over fat. I'm sorry.
But that's when people can come up with excuses, isn't it? Because they'll do that and they'll go, but the reason that why I'm slightly over half is because blah, 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 blah. Genetics, genes, my dad was like that, whatever.
My mother was that way. And
yeah.
So, I'm bloated. I'm really bloated.
Yeah. I had a curry last night. I saw something. It was a guy called Peter Twist who posted this. And it was a certain fast food chain that he'd bought a burger and chips and fries from. Sorry for our American cousins. Chips over here, fries over there. In September 2013, September the 1st, he'd written on the bag in a Sharpie, September 2013. That had faded, so he had to write it on again. The burger and the fries or the chips look exactly the same. There's no mold, there's no nothing. They look exactly the same. And he's just doing it as an experiment every year. So that's 8 years. And the things haven't degraded at all. You've probably got plastic that started to degrade.
Oh yeah,
that.
I mean, that's yeah, and that's so the junk food has some attributes. Long shelf life. Accessibility, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. It's in hospitals.
Good for cavity wall insulation. It's good for
yeah. It's in your dentist's office, and it's cheap.
In a scenario where
seemingly cheap.
Seemingly, yeah. In a scenario where someone was, for example, let's take someone who's eating the classic paleo diet of whole foods, everything's organic, and they have a calorie surplus that was in excess of what they needed. And they were putting weight on and they became over fat. Would there be a different distribution of fat to someone who was eating a more processed diet with an excess calorie intake? Or is it just the calorie intake that's causing the fat? Is there any difference in distribution?
There are individual differences where some people will emphasize their abdominal fat. Hormonal differences dictate that. Ethnicity dictates that. I mentioned the Indians. That they don't have any fat on their arms and legs. It's all almost all in the abdomen. So there are differences, but the waist to height ratio, taking in the abdominal fat, seems to not miss many of those people. And people who are eating a healthy diet can still get over fat, not necessarily only from excess calories, but there's a metabolic factor that, it's not calories in, calories out. And the reason it's not is because what we eat affects our metabolism. And if our metabolism dictates that we're going to burn a lot more sugar and not much fat, well, the fat has to go somewhere. And so it goes into storage. And that's how we can get fat, even with the right caloric intake. And people don't understand that, well, I eat low fat. So how could I? Well, half the carbohydrate you eat turns to fat, even if it's natural carbohydrate. So, consider that. And then the fact that many people become insulin resistant, what I call carbohydrate intolerant, which is a better name because it refers to the problem. Many people become more carbohydrate intolerant with age. It's partly normal, but it's partly the fact that we start at such a bad place that, aging brings us, that process worsens a little bit. But we're seeing younger and younger people becoming very carbohydrate intolerant. At one time, adults who got type 2 diabetes were called type 2 adult onset diabetes. Then it started happening in kids, and they, quietly dropped the adult onset. So we're seeing, and the obesity rates in children are, in the U.S. it's about 70% of obesity of overfat in children, and very similar. All the world is. There's no more, developing countries, and they're going to be different. They're really not. They've come on board to the Western world by getting overfat in the same ways. They're developing the same chronic diseases. Infectious diseases are no longer the number one killer in those countries. It's modern chronic diseases, and so we're all one big world now, and it's really gotten quite.
Well, one of the things that I do find with the 2-week test, though, in is to reconfigure people's thinking, is that they sometimes do fear carbohydrates. How do you? What role do you see carbohydrates? Because obviously they're very tasty.
That's a good point.
They are super tasty. Let's be honest,
Well, because carbohydrates affect our metabolism immediately, and we're talking about, as soon as we put it in our mouth and start chewing it, there's an effect. But there's a really strong effect after the second meal. So you have 2 meals. After the second meal, the metabolic effect is quite dramatic. So that doesn't happen with fat, and it doesn't happen with protein. So if you want to figure out your diet, if you want to, let me see what makes me feel the best. I've done the 2-week test, and now I'm going to start adding some natural carbohydrates. Let's see if these bring back symptoms. That's what it's all about, is individualizing it. And it's partly about counting the carbohydrate grams, but it's really about what makes you feel good. Can you eat a meal and stop at some point partway through the meal and say, I've had enough? Animals tend to do that in nature, and humans no doubt did that for millions of years. And we've lost that ability.
Animals have
I
as
know.
well.
I know some, we touched on alcoholism, but one of the things about alcoholics is that they could never leave a drink on the table, on the bar. They got to finish it. Well, that's not just alcohol. That's addiction in general. And people who are eating carbohydrates and addicted to them cannot leave that big pile of pasta or that bread on their plate. They have to finish it as much as it hurts. It's sort of the addiction component of carbohydrates.
It's funny because that happens now. But for us, like, I think we all grew up in the 80s, and then you would have been before that, obviously, Phil, but like
Late 70s.
we were told to clean our plates because food's, food, it wasn't scarce, but like, it wasn't as abundant as it is now, and my parents grew up after the war and what have you. So that was an after an effect of that. You have to eat your dinner. You have to clean your plate, but then there wasn't as much on your plate. So do you think that's fed forwards now as well? Fed forwards, pardon the pun, but do you reckon that's now? One. So people are like, I have to clean my plate, but you can keep
there's we tend to carry these things along that we hear we hear them as kids, and they really stay in our brains. And we've all been influenced by, just going back to the Depression. My parents were part of that as kids, but their parents influenced them, and then they influenced me. And finishing your plate, that whole thing. So we have that, but we're intelligent enough to relearn the necessary ideas to make us healthy. At least they're available. Whether we want to take them on or not is another thing. So,
James, you've been experimenting you've played with fasting and things like that, and you're on pretty low carb at the moment with a mainly kind of carnivore approach, haven't you?
Yeah, I've been since I read The Primal Blueprint by Mark Sisson, and he obviously references a lot of your work, Phil. And prior to that, a long while ago, I read this Slow Burn by Stu Mittelman, who I know you worked with a lot as well. So similar things. And I've really reduced almost totally, sugar and grains and things, and actually feel great. Feel really good on it. It's been 6 months now, and don't really miss it at all. So I feel strong and fit and healthy, and I'm leaner, and energy is more balanced. So I think it's great. But I can see how it's a big change for many people to get away from that, because everybody, we see it every day in the gym where people, you may have someone who is, obese or over fat, but they feel they need to eat a banana before they exercise, or they need to have something to eat so they've got energy to exercise. And it's just not having, where they've got all this energy they're storing that they're never tapping into. So it's such a difficult one to deal with the everyday population, I think, around this.
Yeah, we still have the tradition, but we have to think for ourselves, and we have to ask ourselves, do I have what I want? Do I have it? Do I have the body weight I want, the body fat I want? Am I performing well? Am I injured? Does my brain work well? All these things. And like I said in the beginning, we can have it all. Because if something's not working, it means there's still something wrong, and we can use our instincts and intuition to figure it out, or we could learn about stuff like the 2-week test or the MAF test, and be able to start analyzing the process ourselves so that we can make some intelligent decisions.
I think that's a good place to perhaps wrap up, because we could go so deep into some other subjects, and I think what I do like is just maybe ending on this area, or you go back to your own ability to choose and use your intelligence. That the brain is the thing that's guiding us. It is. There's a chapter in your book called "No Pain, No Brain" or something. It's so important that we have control.
It's the brain is like the missing link across the board. I'm amazed at people who do therapies, practitioners, coaches, dietitians. You mentioned the brain, and it's like, oh, the brain. This is our most valuable asset. This is what we're going to be left with, at 120 years of age. We're not going to be running marathons, but we're going to be understanding, if we play the game right, we're going to be thinking really well and understanding well and communicating well, because our brain has a different aging process than our body. With age, we we get a little slower. Our reaction times are slower. Our muscle mass goes down, although our strength doesn't necessarily go down. And all this stuff, and that's been happening since we were in our 20s. But our brain is going the other way. My brain works better today than it's ever worked in my life, and that's how it should be. And part of that is figuring out these things for ourselves. And I still do it. I'm still, I'm noticing something, and then I think, oh, what did I have in my last meal? And it tells you something. And we have this intelligence that's so important to use.
Yeah, we've got to just listen to our bodies and listen to what it's telling us.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, there's so many things we could have covered today. I've even got the book, the 159, which was released before Kipchoge got his 2-hour marathon. So that's probably something we could delve into another time. But I thought, well, one thing I would say is that animals are starting to replicate us, because I used to have a dog about 20 years ago, and he managed to break into the larder and ate the entire bag of dog biscuits, which are mainly carbohydrates or whatever. And she didn't stop eating, to the point where she almost expanded to about 3 times the size. And for about 5 days, we didn't feed her or give her hardly any water because we were scared she was going to burst. So I know that I know that animals are perhaps adopting our.
I've had patients like that.
Yes. So Peter, anything you'd like to leave us with?
I did have a thought, but then when Phil said that, I've just lost it. Yeah, I did have. I can't remember what it was now.
Well, I'll move to James then. He seems a bit.
Oh no, I know what I was going to say.
No,
Jim
lost
Hatchett.
your chance.
Jim Hatchett. No. Yeah, Phil was talking about the brain. I like that. You say you talk to a lot of people and they go, "Oh yeah, the brain," and it's like, yeah, that governs absolutely everything, and it's obviously very important. And we were talking to Jim Hatcher, who's a guy. He'll be 80 now. I think he'll have had his what did he call it? 1-up day or whatever it was, his birthday. So he'd be 80 now. But he was on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, and he's very, very lucid when he talks. He's just there, and his body can't do what it used to be able to do and all that, but he still keeps himself fit.
He's still pretty strong for his age, though, isn't he?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. But he's but he was talking about doing things to keep you engaged, he's like, he said, there's 168 hours in a week. After sleep, eating, whatever, you've got 90 hours left. If you're retired, what are you going to do with those hours? Because if you don't do anything, your brain's going to disappear. So
exactly. Yeah. And that's the danger of that R word. People retire. And, when they would tell me that, I'd say, well, what are you going to do? Well, I'm going to be retired. Yeah. And I've had people say to me, yeah, I'm retired now. I pretty much just watch TV all day. What a disservice to our human body that, somebody could do that. Like, okay, I'm waiting to die. It's going to be a while, but it's like being in a waiting room.
The medicine's going to keep me alive for forever, because he's been retired 20 years and he's still really sharp. So yeah, there you go.
There's you, James.
No, I just want to say thank you to Phil for a fantastic conversation. And I was driving with Dan John, who was over in England recently, and he said he's been referencing your work since the mid '80s to people. And I said we were going to have you on the podcast, and he said, "How the hell did you get hold of him?" He said, "I've never met him, but I've been referencing his work since the mid '80s." So no, it's just been great to talk to you. And so much of what I read and so many people that I talk to and so many courses I go on, they're always, reference your work. So to actually get to speak to you in person has been a real pleasure and a real honor. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks, the three of you. This has been a lot of fun. And let me know when you post this. Send me a link, and I'll help promote it. And who knows? Maybe we'll do it again sometime.
Well, we'll open up. It's just that kind of cross-fertilization of strength and endurance. It's kind of the same thing in a way. It's kind of coming from the same
It
place.
Is very, very much. And we're not just talking about athletes. We're talking about the entire population. We are endurance animals, and we have this really strange, unique ability to sprint for just short periods of time. And we're obviously in need of a good amount of strength. So one big package.
And I was just going to ask Phil, if people want to find out more about you, your kind of work on the kind of physiology and endurance and nutrition side, but then also I know you've got your whole music side as well. Where do people find out about you and delve in more?
My health and fitness site is philmaffetone.com, and there are literally hundreds of articles on there that people can read. And then there's sort of a programmed text where you can go and answer a lot of questions, and it'll guide you through finding your risk factors and what you can do about them and all that stuff. My music, if people don't know, I woke up one day in 2002 as a songwriter, and I have had so much fun with that. I just released my 8th album earlier this year, and that world of mine is called maffetonemusic.com, and you can find me on any one of the 150 some odd streaming sites on the internet as well.
Well, you have a deep history of musicians as well. Johnny Cash, and you work with the Chili Peppers, and you've kind of attracted so many different people from different worlds saying, okay, we need a bit of this. What's this guy on about? So, I mean, we could go into that on another chance to chat with you. But look, thank you very much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure. As I said at the beginning, you played such a large role in me getting back on top of my health, which went downhill very quickly in my 20s for my own choices. But it was my own choice to get back up again. But look, so check out Phil Maffetone's website, check out his music, and do email us in our Health Oddity group if you want to have any questions for any of our guests in future, or you don't quite understand any of the concepts. We're happy to give you some more information about how to understand some of the ideas that are going through our podcast. But once again, subscribe, like us on YouTube, share this with your friends. We're Health Oddity. It's Paul, James, Peter, and thank you once again to Phil, our guest. See you soon.
You've been listening to Health Odyssey with Peter Lant, Paul Bassett, and James St. Pierre. To get your regular fix of hype-free health, you can subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your favorite podcasts. You can find out more on today's and other topics at healthodyssey.com, or find us on Facebook or Instagram by searching for Health Oddity.